Good morning, class. Let us read the book. A says aeroplane. A says alligator. A says ant. A says anchor. A says apple. A says album. A says abacus. A says X. B says bird. B says boy. B says bucket. B says ball. B says bat. B says butterfly. B says bench. B says balloon. B says bicycle. B says bubble. B says boat. C says clown. C says coffee. C says cane. C says cookie. C says candy. C says corn. C says cat. C says curtain. C says candle. C says cake. C says camera. C says cap. D says daisy. D says doll. D says door. D says duck. D says drum. D says donkey. D says dove. D says dad. D says dog. E says engine. E says ear. E says envelope. E says eagle. E says eye. E says elephant. E says egg. F says face. F says fire. F says finger. F says flower. F says father. F says fish. F says food. F says fork. F says fruits. F says fence. G says goat. G says grass. G says gate. G says girl. G says gift. G says grapes. G says goose. H says house. H says hat. H says hand. H says hammer. H says hill. H says hay. H says horse. H says hive. H says hen. H says helicopter. I says igloo. I says iron. I says insect. I says ink pot. I says ice. I says invitation. I says ice cream. I says idli. J says jug. J says juice. J says jackfruit. J says jelly. J says jam. J says jasmine. J says jacket. J says jeans. K says king. K says keyboard. K says kid. K says kitten. K says kite. K says kangaroo. K says key. K says cattle. K says kiwi. L says lamb. L says leaf. L says lotus. L says ladybird. L says lizard. L says lantern. L says leopard. M says muskmelon. M says muffin. M says mango. M says milk. M says mug. M says man. M says mirror. M says mouse. M says mop. M says mat. N says notepad. N says newspaper. N says nuts. N says napkin. N says nurse. N says necktie. N says neck. N says nose. O says owl. O says octopus. O says orchids. O says oats. O says ox. O says ostrich. O says orange. O says oil. P says pot. P says pizza. P says papaya. P says parrot. P says purse. P says paper. P says pen. P says plate. Q says quarter. Q says quill. Q says quill. Q says queen. Q says quilt. R says ribbon. R says rabbit. R says rose. R says ring. R says rocket. R says rainbow. R says dinosaurs. R says robin. S says ship. S says spider. S says snake. S says sunflower. S says sandwich. S says sun. S says sea. S says swing. S says stone. S says slide. S says shoes. T says train. T says telescope. T says tent. T says tomato. T says top. T says trunk. T says tree. T says truck. T says tap. T says towel. U says uniform. U says unicycle. U says umbrella. U says umbrella bird. U says unicorn. U says empire. V says vulture. V says violin. V says vest. V says violet. V says vase. V says van. V says vegetables. W says woodpecker. W says window. W says well. W says watermelon. W says whistle. W says violet. W says walnut. W says watch. W says wheel. W says wall. W says wool. W says water. X says Xmas tree. X says Xmas card. X says X-ray. X says Xenops. X says Xerox machine. X says xylophone. Y says yoga. Y says yogurt. Y says yam. Y says yo-yo. Y says yacht. Y says yak and Y says yarn. Z says zip. Z says zoo. Z says zero. Z says zigzag. Z says zinnia. Z says zebra. Z says zoo. Thank you. Have a nice day.